With the amount of games SpongeBob was receiving in the mid-2000s, it gets to a point where you really need to get creative and find ways to make each new game unique. I've covered half a dozen SpongeBob games already, so at this point just having regular old SpongeBob save Bikini Bottom isn't going to move the C needle much. Most of the GBA titles were basically identical 2D platformers, and I've now covered 3 3D platformers that, while pretty high quality, are all built in a similar style. I feel like Yellow Avenger really marks the start of developers getting very experimental with what a SpongeBob game will be. Things like Drawn to Life SpongeBob Edition, Beach Party Cook-Off, Boating Bash, and Surf and Skate Road Trip really tested the waters rather than just slapping together something fans had already seen. You might not have ever heard or seen much of SpongeBob SquarePants Yellow Avenger, but it's definitely one of the more memorable SpongeBob games ever made. I'm Brandon, and I'll be your captain for this journey through Nickelodeon video game history. Released on November 7, 2005 for the Nintendo DS, Yellow Avenger also followed up with a PlayStation Portable version on March 6 of the following year, which was the first time Nick had actually graced the PSP. Both games are essentially identical in structure, with the only differences really being in terms of graphical fidelity, and the fact that the DS also takes advantage of the touchscreen for some of its controls. Tantalus Media was responsible for both versions here, so it's no surprise that they're so similar, rather than the typical split you would see between a home console and a handheld. We've encountered Tantalus once before with Attack of the Twonkies on GBA, a game I absolutely hated. They'd also go on to develop the DS version of Ben 10 Galactic Racing, which I haven't played, but if it's anything like its home console counterpart, I'd probably like it just as much as Attack of the Twonkies. Tantalus is still around today, but like most devs that were big in the licensed game space that managed to survive the death of THQ, they're used primarily as a support studio nowadays. Critically, Yellow Avenger is all over the place, and I can't understand why. The PSP version scored a horrifying 4.8 average review score, but for some reason the DS version scored a 6.7 average. This is so confusing because as far as I can tell, both games are almost identical. If anything, I would have thought the PSP release would score higher thanks to the prettier graphics. The DS version's review average is even more impressive when you consider it received a 3.5 out of 10 from Nintendo Power. The critical reception of Yellow Avenger is just so chaotic. Despite the poor reception on PSP, the game still made its way into the PSP Greatest Hits lineup. In fact, basically every SpongeBob game released on a PlayStation console up until the PSP managed to sneak its way into this collection. As of December 2008, it was one of the highest selling PSP games of all time, which allowed Yellow Avenger to be placed into Sony's budget line that they roll out for every console. Sales numbers for games have been a bit shaky and not very reliable up until quite recently, but it's estimated that Yellow Avenger sold around 920,000 copies, which would have put it quite close to being in the top 20 best-selling games for the PSP. This game clearly found an audience, but the critical reception is all over the place. Just what does the Yellow Avenger have in store for me? I'm here to talk about the SpongeVenger initiative. So SpongeBob has got superpowers. The Yellow Avenger's narrative sees Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy taking on the Dirty Bubble to kickstart things. Unfortunately, it all goes a little haywire and a bunch of miniature Dirty Bubbles get unleashed on Bikini Bottom. For some reason, the crime-fighting duo can't be asked with helping out clean up this mess, so they just toss Mermaid Man's belt at SpongeBob and get him to do it. With that narrative setup, you'd probably expect some sort of beat 'em up or maybe a platformer with a heavy focus on combat. Somehow, you'd be wrong in both cases for assuming that. At a quick glance, this is a 2.5D platformer. You'll be platforming from location to location in Bikini Bottom, but when you arrive at your destination, the game frequently turns into something of a point-and-click adventure game. You're constantly being given quests, many of which involve scanning areas and trying to locate items. Many of those items actually seem completely random at first too. And to top it off, it's got a bit of a Metroidvania influence from the fact that SpongeBob is being drip-fed new superpowers as you progress. So many areas of Bikini Bottom will be inaccessible until you get the right power, which will unlock new sections or even entirely new locations. Yellow Avenger is such a fascinating amalgamation of genres and styles we don't often see in Nickelodeon video game history, but is it fun to play? Well, I'm not too sure about that. The first minor issue you bump into is the platforming. Jumping makes you feel like you're underwater. Yeah, you quite literally are underwater, but floaty platforming is never ideal. I feel like most devs deliberately go for this when making a SpongeBob game, and it's always a huge misstep. Characters in Bikini Bottom might literally be underwater, but they don't move around like they're underwater, so it's extremely unnecessary to make the movement feel like this. The floaty platforming also makes most of the platforming irrelevant. SpongeBob's double jump clears most gaps in the game. There are spots where the game wants him to use these poles to swing around and clear gaps, but they are totally unnecessary. The DS version of Yellow Avenger is, unsurprisingly, very touchscreen focused. To activate one of SpongeBob's newfound powers, you need to find one of these pads, stand on it, and then draw a symbol. This then starts a timer where you have a very limited window to use the power. SpongeBob can do stuff like summon sea creatures to use as a platform, shoot a bubble ball, and gain super strength. To use the superpowers for a bit longer than the standard time limit, you'll need to fill up your superpower meter, which requires you to capture little dirty bubbles. As you're running around Bikini Bottom, you'll find citizens being harassed. Jumping on their head will save them and allow you to grab a dirty bubble, which fills up your meter. Saving people from the dirty bubble doesn't always go to plan though. Much like the MCU, Yellow Avenger isn't too concerned with lingering on the collateral damage caused by superpowers. SpongeBob killed several civilians in the course of my playthrough. Tantalus also used a similar mechanic for refilling SpongeBob's health. You'll frequently come across jellyfish, and if you grab these, it takes you to a minigame where you have to milk them.
Oh yeah, you can milk anything with nipples.
Doing this gives you jelly that is stored in your inventory and will restore your health when used. The game actually requires some thought when doing this jellyfish milking. You have to get the rhythm correct to extract more jelly from them. If you just start yanking these teats, you'll get a smaller return. Having to constantly milk jellyfish if you want to restore your health is unbelievably tedious. I would have much preferred if you just had to grab them to restore your health. With this game being sold as a superhero tale and SpongeBob literally receiving superpowers, you'd imagine this would be an action-packed game, but that's just not the case. You almost never use your powers in a combat scenario. Instead, you use them to complete the dozens of fetch quests thrown at you. Characters just give you a never-ending list of menial things to go find, which is made all the more tedious by how sprawling this game's world is. Bikini Bottom is surprisingly and impressively big here. There are 9 different locations and they all interconnect. Each area is generally pretty big in scope too, usually to accommodate the fact that there are locked paths that you can't get to until you obtain certain powers. To help with this a little bit, there's a bus stop in each area to allow for quick travel, but this only improves things slightly. Areas are so big and bus stops so infrequent that most of the game still ends up consisting of you running back and forth through the same locations a million times. My best advice for anybody attempting to play this game is to be absolutely thorough when exploring areas. Grab every item you can on your first visit. So often I saved considerable time by doing this. There were multiple occasions where it was clear the game wanted to send me back to a location I had just come from, but because I was thorough, I was able to cut through some of the backtracking. I think the fetch quests and backtracking feel even worse because Bikini Bottom is so devoid of life. The only time you encounter any people in this ghost town is when they're being harassed by dirty bubbles. Other than that, characters really only pop up when they're specifically linked to a quest. I will say though, Tantalus should be commended for the very handy quest log here. For a game like this, a quest log should be standard to make sure you aren't ever wandering around aimlessly, but the quality of the directions given in the quest log here is spot on. Tantalus is never vague about what you should do, so you at least feel like you're always progressing forward, even if the never-ending fetch quests are a slog. I imagine one of the reasons the DS version scored higher than the PSP version is the second screen integration. This is used for the powers as I mentioned, as well as some literal point and click gameplay, But outside of that, it always displays either a world map, inventory, or your quest log. Having all this key info always on display made this experience so much more friendly. But I think the biggest sin of the Yellow Avenger is that it's way too long. It will take you 5+ hours to beat if you know exactly what to do at all times. Probably the most accurate genre this game falls into is point and click adventure. If you were to play a staple of that genre, such as the Monkey Island games for example, a playthrough where you're solving everything relatively quickly will take between 3 and 7 hours, depending on which entry you're playing. It's baffling that Tantalus decided to have this game stick around for so long, especially when most of the game just consists of backtracking to pick up and deliver items. For the average player on their first playthrough, Yellow Avenger is likely to take close to 10 hours to beat. It's just way too long for what it is. Visually, the game looks pretty good most of the time, especially for being the first SpongeBob DS game. They did the Flying Dutchman dirty with his character model, but outside of that, Bikini Bottom is recreated really well, and like I mentioned, the scope of the environments here is rather impressive. I could have gone for some more variety in the music though. You pretty much get one song per area, and with the amount of backtracking going on, it gets grating quickly. It's just another aspect that makes the Yellow Avenger feel so repetitive.
Receiving incoming transmission.
Target lost.
I didn't really enjoy the Yellow Avenger, but I didn't exactly hate it either. It's got some interesting ideas, and some genuinely good ideas too, but it never comes together cohesively to make a good game. The combination of point and click adventure and Metroidvania, tied up in a 2.5D platformer package, is so unique, but the way Tantalus cooked it up doesn't work. I kind of get the vibe that being tied to the DS may have held this game back a bit. I feel that if it was PSP exclusive, they could have utilised the more powerful hardware to lean into the combat and superpowers more, and it should have allowed them to make Bikini Bottom feel more lively. Tying the powers almost exclusively to removing roadblocks or jumping over obstacles is a big letdown. Next time, we'll be heading to the movies once again to cover the video game adaptations of Barnyard. We'll be covering both the handheld and home console version, with Barnyard actually being the very first Nickelodeon game on the Wii. I've never actually seen the film, but Back at the Barnyard was a show I loathed on Nickelodeon when I was a kid. Hopefully this game will give me a more positive experience with the franchise. To make sure you don't miss that video or any of my upcoming reviews, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the channel, jump over to Twitter and give me a follow.